Raspberry flavoring is usually reserved for the high-stakes world of hard candies or overpriced yogurt. In 1937, it became the signature scent of illegal mass poisoning. Imagine a medicine that tastes like summer fruit, but acts like a corrosive cocktail for your internal organs. More than 100 people, most of them children, died in unrelenting agony because a company decided to sell a product they hadn't bothered to test. The most disturbing part of this story is not that a company was negligent. The real horror is that under the laws of the United States at the time, they weren't breaking a single rule. It was perfectly legal to sell a liquid that would liquefy a child's kidneys, provided you didn't lie about what you called it on the bottle. This is the story of how a miracle became a massacre, and how a bureaucratic technicality became the only thing that could stop it. In the year 1937, the American drug market was a playground for anyone with a chemistry set and a dream. The primary law governing what you put in your body was the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906. While that sounds official and reassuring, it was effectively a glorified labeling requirement. It was a law concerned with honesty, not safety. You could sell a bottle of industrial runoff as a headache cure, as long as you didn't claim there was alcohol in it when there wasn't. By the 1930s, everyone realized this law was as obsolete as a horse-drawn ambulance. Yet congressional action was stalled in a swamp of disagreement. Imagine a world where your pharmacist has the same legal safety requirements as a guy selling homemade lemonade on a street corner. That was the American medical reality. There was no federal regulatory control that required a company to prove a drug was safe before shipping it to your local doctor. Anyone could manufacture almost any substance and market it to the public without a single animal test or clinical trial. The burden of proof wasn't on the manufacturer to show a drug was safe. It was on the government to prove it was dangerous after the bodies started piling up. During this era, if the government wanted to stop a poisoner, they had to prove a misbranding violation. This legally meant the government had to find a technical lie on the label, like the presence of an undisclosed narcotic or a false alcohol claim, rather than simply pointing at a pile of corpses and saying, that shouldn't be for sale. If the label was technically honest about what was inside, the fact that what was inside happened to be lethal was legally irrelevant. This is why radioactive cures like Radithor could be sold to the social elite, leading to people like Eben Byers, literally having his bones disintegrate and his jaw fall off. Byers consumed 1,400 bottles of radium-infused water before he died in 1932, his jaw literally crumbling away before the end. Even after that high-profile horror, the law remained a sieve. The regulatory vacuum meant that the great and reputable firms of the era were essentially operating on the honor system. It was a system built on the assumption that killing your customers is bad for business, which is a lovely sentiment that ignores how much money you can make. Before the customers actually die, this regulatory vacuum wasn't just a quirk of history. It was a fatal gap waiting for the right disaster to fill it. Before it became a weapon of mass destruction, sulfanilamide was a genuine hero. It was the first real antibacterial wonder drug, a chemical miracle that could cure streptococcal infections, that had previously been a death sentence. In the 1930s, a strep infection wasn't just a reason to stay home from school. It was a terrifying gamble with mortality. Sulfanilamide had been shown to have dramatic curative effects, and had been used safely for some time in tablet and powder form, saving countless lives and earning a reputation as a medical breakthrough. This was the cutting edge of science, a way to fight back against the microscopic monsters that had plagued humanity since we lived in caves. People trusted sulfanilamide because it worked. It was a good drug, a product of legitimate medical research and progress. The S.E. Massengill Company of Bristol, Tennessee, was one of the firms supplying this legitimate professional demand. They were a reputable pharmaceutical manufacturer, the kind of place a doctor would feel comfortable, ordering from without a second thought. The tragedy wasn't that they were selling snake oil or a fake cure. They were selling a powerful, effective antibiotic. They just happened to be selling it in a way that turned the cure into a poison. Success, as it turns out, is the mother of very bad ideas. The bad idea started with a simple request from the field. In June 1937, a salesman for the Massengill Company reported a high demand in the southern states for sulfanilamide in liquid form. It turns out that people, especially parents of small children with sore throats, prefer a sweet syrup over a bitter pill. The company's chief chemist and pharmacist, a man named Harold Cole Watkins, was tasked with finding a way to dissolve the drug into a liquid. After some experimentation, Watkins discovered that sulfanilamide would dissolve quite nicely in a chemical called diethylene glycol. For those who aren't chemists, diethylene glycol is a chemical normally used as an industrial solvent and antifreeze. It is also a deadly poison to humans and other mammals. Watkins apparently was not aware of this fact. He simply mixed in some raspberry flavoring to mask the chemical taste, checked the mixture for appearance and fragrance, and declared it a success. The Massengill Control Lab approved the product because it looked right, smelled like berries, and tasted fine. They performed no toxicity tests because the law didn't require them to. They didn't even bother to check the existing scientific literature, which already contained studies from as early as 1930, stating that related chemicals could cause fatal kidney failure. In their rush to satisfy a salesman's request, they skipped the not killing people part of the development process. Massengill immediately compounded a massive quantity of this Elixir Sulfanilamide and sent out 633 shipments across 15 states, from Virginia to California. They were shipping 240 gallons of raspberry-scented death to a public that trusted them. Taste tests are wonderful for soda companies, but they are a poor substitute for understanding how a chemical interacts with a human kidney. The reckoning began in October 1937. The American Medical Association started receiving frantic reports from physicians in Tulsa, Oklahoma, about an unfamiliar sulfanilamide compound that seemed to be followed by a trail of corpses. The symptoms were consistent and horrific: stoppage of urine, severe abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, stupor, and convulsions. Patients, many of them children being treated for simple sore, would linger for 7 to 21 days in unrelenting agony, as their kidneys simply stopped functioning. There was no known antidote. On October 22, 1937, Dr. A.S. Calhoun, a physician who had practiced for over a quarter of a century, wrote a letter that laid bare the human cost. He wrote, "Nobody but Almighty God and I can know what I have been through these past few days to realize that 6 human beings, all of them my patients, one of them my best friend, are dead because they took medicine that I prescribed for them innocently. That realization has given me such days and nights of mental and spiritual agony, as I did not believe a human being could undergo and survive. I have known hours when death for me would be a welcome relief from this agony." A New York physician notified the Food and Drug Administration, and the agency's entire field force of 239 inspectors and chemists was mobilized for a desperate nationwide manhunt. They had to track down 240 gallons of poison before more people swallowed it. The staff began by checking shipping records and distribution lists in 4 houses and numerous drugstores, examining thousands of order slips one by one. In one establishment alone, 20,000 sales slips were checked. The FDA employees tracked down the firm's 200 salesmen, but finding them was the first hurdle. In one typical case, a salesman was reported to be in a hotel in Washington, D.C., but he wasn't there. Forwarding addresses had been left for him in Jackson, Michigan, and in Baltimore, but those turned out to be for another man with the same name. It took 4 days of searching to finally find the man, in University Park, Maryland. Once the salesmen were found, getting the distribution information was still a struggle. One man in Texas only revealed his list after being jailed by state authorities. Locating the purchasers of the elixir required real detective work. In some drugstores, the elixir had been sold without prescriptions to people whose names the druggist didn't know. Some doctors had no records at all of the patients, for whom they had prescribed the drug. In East St. Louis, Illinois, 49 prescriptions were filled, and the only identification on some were notations like Betty Jane, 9 months old, or Mrs. Jackson, no address, making the victims nearly impossible to trace in time. Even when purchasers were located, inspectors had to use ingenious questioning to find out where the elixir went. One East St. Louis woman told an inspector she had destroyed the drug. The inspector persisted, asking if she poured it down the sink or buried it. She eventually admitted she had just thrown the bottle out the window into an alley. The inspector found the bottle still unbroken, still containing enough elixir to kill any child curious enough to swallow it. Many doctors and pharmacists did everything in their power to help. One physician even postponed his own wedding to help an FDA chemist search for a 3-year-old boy, whose family had moved into mountain country after obtaining a prescription. Other physicians were reluctant to admit they had prescribed the drug, perhaps fearing accountability. In Georgia, a druggist told an inspector that only 6 ounces of a gallon shipment had been dispensed and that the patient was fine. But the inspector at the Bristol headquarters reported that 12 ounces were actually missing from that returned gallon. After following local gossip, the Georgia inspector learned that 2 other people had bought the elixir. Both were dead. In South Carolina, a doctor claimed he had dispensed the medicine to only 5 people and none had died. An inspector heard rumors of the death of a lumber mill employee and followed the trail. He found the man's sister, who confirmed her brother had taken red medicine before he died. In accordance with local custom, all medicines and sickroom utensils had been placed on the grave, 1.5 miles back in the fields. The inspector walked to the wooded knoll and found a 4-ounce bottle on the fresh earth, containing about 1 ounce of the elixir, still bearing the doctor's prescription label. In reality, 4 of that doctor's patients had died. Amidst this, a grieving mother wrote to President Roosevelt about her daughter Joan. She described watching her child's little body tossing to and fro, and hearing her little voice screaming with pain, pleading for steps to prevent such sales of drugs that take little lives. The chemist, Harold Watkins, apparently felt the weight of this agony. He committed suicide while awaiting trial. The owner, Samuel Evans Massengill, was less burdened. He infamously stated that he felt no responsibility, claiming they were just supplying a legitimate professional demand and could not have foreseen the results. Miraculously, the FDA retrieved 234 gallons and 1 pint of the original 240. They were only able to seize the drug on a technicality. The product was labeled an elixir, which implied it contained alcohol. Since it was dissolved in antifreeze instead, they could charge the company with misbranding. If Massengill had called it a solution, the FDA would have had no legal authority to stop the sale. Justice in the 1930s was often a matter of technicalities. But sometimes a technicality is the only thing standing between a population and a raspberry-flavored grave. The tragedy finally shamed Congress into action. FDA Commissioner Walter Campbell, who had been pressing for better regulation, pointed out the absurdity of the situation. He argued that it was unfortunate that the agency was obliged to proceed against this product on a technical and trivial charge of misbranding, when the real issue was a lack of safety testing. He insisted that only a comprehensive federal law could prevent manufacturers from recklessly placing untried drugs on the market at their own whim. In 1938, Congress passed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which gave the FDA the power to require that drugs be proven safe before they could be sold. This created the modern regulatory system we have today, a system born directly from the grief of families who watch their children die for the sake of a raspberry-flavored solvent. This 1938 act did more than just fix the immediate problem. It provided a system of drug control that stimulated research while providing superior protection. Specifically, 25 years later, these very regulations saved the United States from an even greater tragedy, the thalidomide disaster that struck Germany and England, causing thousands of birth defects. While other nations were reeling, the U.S. was protected by the new drug section added after the sulfanilamide massacre. But the story doesn't end in the 20th century. In 2022, history didn't just rhyme. It repeated itself with brutal precision. Over 300 children in the Gambia, Indonesia, and Uzbekistan died after taking over-the-counter cough syrups. The cause? The exact same chemical diethylene glycol. Manufacturers, looking to cut costs, had used the toxic industrial solvent instead of safe, pharmaceutical-grade glycerol. These contaminants, which the World Health Organization notes should never be found in medicines, were once again being fed to children under the age of 5. The WHO had to issue urgent global medical alerts to stop the circulation of these substandard products, calling on governments to increase market surveillance and enforce laws that were supposed to have been settled decades ago. We built the system. We wrote it in the deaths of children. And then, 85 years later, we let the same poison reach the same victims. Given that we keep seeing the same toxic chemicals appearing in medicines nearly a century after we supposedly fixed the problem, do you think the issue is a lack of global regulation? Or is the drive for lower manufacturing costs simply an unstoppable force in the pharmaceutical industry? Let's talk about it in the comments.